Hi, I'm David Partika, and I created CSS Burner as a rapid optimization tool for CSS. One of the underutilized functions of CSS Burner is the statistical analysis function, which we can access by clicking on the bar graph icon on the top. And what I'm going to do today is show you strategy for using statistical analysis for one of the analysis functions in particular. Now, I've taken the liberty of pre-populating the text area with a style sheet that is 583 kilobytes in length. And so let's go to the analysis functions that we have. Let's look at the dropdown. And what I want to do is show you how you can use the @rules counting function, so number of occurrences, to be able to help you get more insight into your style sheet or to get a unique perspective, a different angle on how you can start to analyze your style sheet. So let's click the Analyze button, and within a few seconds, we'll get a count of, in this case, the top 8 most frequently used media selectors or @rules. So what we see is that the distribution ranges from one occurrence, which is for the @ms keyframes rule, to 159 occurrences for @media. So a couple things that I could already get from this data, and maybe these are ways of looking at your style sheet that you might not have thought of before. So for one, I would strongly consider removing the MS keyframes rule from the style sheet, because between Moz, WebKit, and unprefixed @keyframes, I don't see, especially with browsers, as well adjusted as they are to being able to use unprefixed versions of properties and selectors, I don't see any reason to keep MS keyframes around unless there's a specific old IE browser that is important to the user in this case. Another piece of data that is very obvious here is that the users, the authors of this style sheet, clearly favor the @media rule. It overwhelmingly is most common in this style sheet, which tells me that this the style sheet that powers the relevant application, that application heavily relies on responsive design. So this style sheet most likely powers different media types and different screen resolutions. So you can get that kind of insight by looking at this statistical analysis. In addition, another thing that I see is that, again, presentation must be important for this style sheet because the @font face rule was referenced 19 times. So there are 19 custom fonts that the users for this style sheet thought were of importance for the end user. Another piece of data you can extract from this bar graph is you see that now if we're supporting different prefixed and unprefixed version of @keyframes, well, clearly animation is important in this style sheet because there are 16 occurrences, but let's make sure that the count of each, and it is in fact equal, let's make sure that the count is equal for all three. What I've seen in some style sheets is that the count of the prefix versions is not equal for each prefixed versus unprefixed. That is, you should see an equal number of unprefixed and each prefixed version. And if you don't, that suggests that perhaps the authors of the style sheet just made a mistake and forgot to include one of the prefixed or unprefixed versions, because doesn't really make sense to me that if you went through that whole ordeal of including, that much bandwidth in your style sheet, because each one of these keyframe selectors is going to have, within it, rules for whatever the situation is for the animation. Then why not make sure, if you're aiming for browser coverage, why not make sure that you have the same browser coverage rules in mind for each prefix and unprefixed version? So you shouldn't have different numbers unless there's some very odd circumstance that your application calls for. So in this case, they are equivalent, but as we've seen before, there's one instance of MS keyframe, so probably it can be removed from the style sheet unless there's a very specific use case for it. So we also see a couple of other things. We see Moz document. Now I'm not sure what the use case for this was, but one thing that to me is kind of glaring in its omission is the lack of @supports rule. So for example, we have here, again, just looking at the prefixed keyframes rules and the unprefixed, clearly there's a focus on browser coverage. And so if the authors are in fact interested in browser coverage, the @supports media rule or conditional rule, I'm sorry, is very useful for ascertaining what exactly a specific browser can handle and support, and for each scenario, just implementing the proper properties. So you could probably nest or find a way to nest the @keyframes rules within an @supports rule to try to determine which one of these is useful for a given browser. So again, it's what's present in the bar graph data, but what's also absent in the bar graph data. And for me, again, here, the most obvious example of absence being the @supports rule being absent, because clearly the authors were aiming for browser coverage, but yet no @supports rule, which would help deal with the issue of browser coverage. So I hope this was able to give you some ideas about how you might use the media or conditional rule count for your style sheets to give you some insight that you perhaps did not have before. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you have not subscribed to the Optimized CSS channel yet, please do so. And once again, I thank you for your time and your attention, and look for some new videos very soon.